I'm going to read first mostly from my sister's book, Integrate Silence, which was really an elegy, a memoir that was written documenting her, one of the pieces of her many pieces of life's work with her that she did studying the AT1 Chugach transient killer whale pod in Prince William Sound. I think it was really hard to pick what to read. She has an incredible voice, and I tried to choose things that really talk about her connection to place and to put that in the context of the environmental situation we have in the world now. So I'm going to start with this is from a passage that was written. The book was actually written between 2010 and 2013 when it was published, and was written actually while she was undergoing treatment for breast cancer. And she reflects back on her life, an ongoing life that she had at that time in Prince William Sound. And this was written about the time when she with her first summer of research. And I think it's a really good example of her keen sense of observation. And this is about one of her origin moments. I can still see those eyes, glossy and black, too big for its face, staring at me. I can still see the gray body plastered to the rock, how the seal pup craned its neck to see if the orca was gone, how it looked at me one more time, weighing the risks before it slipped into the sea and disappeared. Sitting here, writing more than 20 years later, it feels like a parallel reality, a channel I can tune into, that moment, the sky partly clear, the sea lapping against the rock, the orca fin rising and falling in the distance, heading away. That 25-year-old me on the inflatable, I believe I can slip inside her skin, feel the energy that coursed through her nervous system as she scribbled down what she saw into a notebook, as she picked up binoculars to see what would happen next. That younger me didn't ask where the seal pup's mother was. Did the whales eat her? Was she hiding nearby? The younger me didn't know what questions a biologist was supposed to ask. What she did was back the boat away from the rock and head for the orca, propelled by longing. She jotted down what she saw in code, a field sketch drawn on the fly. The questions came later. Every time we're with transients, we see something we've never seen before, she would have said to her field assistant. Neuroscientists have something to say about origin moments. When we experience things for the first time, our brains, like inner diarists, write furiously, recording even the smallest details, a blue sweater, curled orange peels, the tang of salt air on our lips. That's why we remember firsts so vividly, experience them decades later, like it was yesterday. Repeated events over time lay one on top of the other like transparencies, making all the years blend. Time feels slower the first time. Maybe that's why the first summer at whale camp, my initiation into field work with the Chugach transients doesn't feel like the past. It feels like a world side by side with this one, a world I can see if I focus my eyes differently. And then when it comes into focus, one I enter completely, like a diver. I'm grateful, for in many ways that world I knew is gone. That's the other reason it's so clear. That summer was the first, and in important ways the last before the great disaster. Perhaps my vivid memory of that summer has something to do with novelty and something to do with time and memory, but perhaps it's also cinematic, a pre-shock, a scene lit by a lightning flash a second before the bolt strikes, or the slowed down seconds leading up to a crash, or exactly what you were wearing when you heard the shattering news. You have cancer. Before, after. And in that summer, here's a description of her place. The patch of forest ended abruptly in a muskeg beaded with ponds, their water tea-colored from tannins. Hermit thrushes spun flute-toned whirligigs from the tops of wind-twisted mountain hemlocks that grew to shoulder height. Some trees looked half dead, their spiked crowns corkscrewing into the air. Craig said that many were hundreds of years old, natural bonsai, each was shaped not by a careful gardener, but by prevailing winds. The ground from which they grew sprung back under my feet, all moss and swaths of heart-shaped deer cabbage leaves. The Latin name for deer cabbage, Fauria Christogali, stuck in my head like a fairy's jump rope song. We were hiking across a sponge which absorbed 200 or more inches of rainfall every year and held it in suspension close to the earth. When I pushed my hands into the sphagnum, my fingertips touched rock. I could peel back moss to reveal wet basalt. What looked so plush was a thin carpet of life. This was our backyard, flowers speckling the muskeg, shooting stars, marsh marigolds, bog violets, blue flag irises, predatory flytraps hidden among low bush blueberries, and tufts of reindeer lichen. Skunk cabbage grew tall as my waist, the leaves as big as fan blades. I needed a whole new vocabulary to name the variations of one color. Bleached out green of lichen, shadow green of spruce, tropical green of skunk cabbage, waxy maroon green of fauria, pinkish baby green of rusty menziensia, chalk-dusted silver green of false hellebore. So she returned. She left Alaska that first summer and returned the following, and everything had completely changed because on March 24th, 1989, the Exxon Valdez oil spill occurred, soiling Prince William Sound and forever changing that place and the population of whales that she studied. When she started her work with the whales, there were 22 within this somewhat isolated, it's kind of like a isolated branch on the evolutionary tree, these Chugach transients, and there were 22 whales. And after the oil spill over the years, there were only 7 left. And the good news is those 7 still remain. However, there aren't any reproductive age females. So that branch of the evolutionary tree will eventually die out. So she returned, and they had a lot of concerns about whether they'd find the whales, what they would find, and this was a piece about when they found some whales out in Icy Bay. Whales of intertidal zones and forest and night, and one day, whales of ice, in between days of waiting. Immediate reality often eclipses what we know deep down of nature. A few days without orcas, and we imagined the worst. They'd left the sound. Alternately, we agonized over the ways we could be missing them. Searching Pleiades Bay, we knew they might be 5 miles away off Point Helen. Waiting off Point Helen with the hydrophone down, we knew they might be foraging in Dryer Bay or passing whale camp. But all we felt was absence in our narrow field of vision. The presence of oil and the cleanup operation fed this. I wondered how long the Chugach transients would continue to hunt in an area polluted and overrun with boats. But some urges are stronger than catastrophe, at least in the short run. Humans continue to live in places ravaged by hurricane, flood, monsoon, war, volcanic eruption. Orcas continue to hunt in oiled water. I'd read John Forn's paper about Orca vocal traditions, an aspect of their culture, calls taught to calves, maintained through adulthood and passed down the generations. Hunting habits and roots are another aspect of culture, another tradition. Calves learn to navigate the labyrinth by following adults. They learn seal haul out rocks, points where dolls' porpoises feed. They learn silence. Place binds the heart beyond sense sometimes. Wedded to place, the Chugach transients hunted in their old haunts for better or for worse. These thoughts preoccupied me as we searched for transients. I knew that many seals along Knight Island were oiled. I knew the water along the shoreline was tainted, but the transients hunted as they had for millennia. How did they perceive what had happened to the sound? One place they hunted was safe from oil and boats, Icy Bay. One evening, Mary spotted blows off the Pleiades. By the time we caught up, it was 8:30 in the evening. Scrutinizing the catalog, we finally identified the 3 orcas, 18, 19, 20, and 21, an adult male, a female, and an immature. We named them Berg, Hermit, and Icy. We followed them into Icy Bay. To our surprise, they entered thick flows. We knew from Lloyd and Kathy that harbor seals hauled out on ice near tidewater glaciers to molt and give birth. Perhaps during these vulnerable periods, they found shelter from predators close to the faces of calving glaciers, where the ice was thickest, impenetrable to boats, and possibly to predators. Here and there, we spotted seals perched on ice, their back flippers tipped up into the air. Darker blots on the ice turned out to be grooming sea otters. Black fins rose and fell among the blue-white chunks in milky blue water. All around us, ice hissed and churned in currents. A seal resting on a floe craned its neck toward an orca blow. Hermit surfaced a few hundred yards away. Then the seal turned to look at us. Between whale and boat, it hunkered on its ice refuge. A mile into Icy Bay, we maneuvered ahead of the orca trio as they navigated ever thicker floes. When I lowered the hydrophone, I noticed how it disappeared almost immediately into the turbid water. When we turned on the speaker, we heard only static. At first, thinking it was an electrical problem, I fiddled with a wire. Then I realized it was centuries-old ice melting, releasing its load of silt scraped from the land, particles falling to the seafloor, laying down a story of millennia, making a bed for crabs and shrimp. How could the whales hear or see a seal? Yet they swam purposefully as though covering familiar ground. We would come to find out that they used quiet, sporadic echolocation clicks to navigate and hunt. Entering thicker floes, they slowed. We slowed even more, Mary driving at idle speed while I sat on the bow pushing ice out of the way with an oar. Suddenly, a seal popped up alongside us. Mary threw the gear shifter into neutral. The orcas surfaced, the seal hidden by our hull. I told Mary about harbor seals taking shelter beneath skiffs in British Columbia. Sometimes they'd even climbed on boat transoms to escape pursuing transients. Whale One's high sides protected us from such a dilemma: shelter a seal or push it back off. No one I knew had chosen the latter. After a few minutes, the young seal dove and we motored on. As light in the fjord faded, the whales pushed deeper, entering a cove clotted with ice. For a half hour they milled, probably feeding. It was too dark to tell. We checked our watches, 11 p.m. We checked the chart, which showed shallow water but no rocks. We checked the tide books, still flooding. It would ebb at 3 a.m. Not a big tide, so we dropped anchor. After its clatter, we heard the whales departing blows. Then we crawled into our sleeping bags. Half awake, I listened to thunder. Tiger Tail Glacier, shedding another ice wall. I imagined the pressure wave rolling out from its face, hauled out seals rising and falling with the swell. I shivered. The air was cold, much colder than at whale camp. Those 3 Chugach transients were ice whales. The Chugach transients were whales of every way the sound expressed herself. And then on July 9th, 1989, yesterday, Mary and I hiked on Crafton Island, not realizing it had been heavily oiled. We found an oil-coated river otter skull. Even the grass above tide line was black. I told Mary about the first time I'd come there. One spring day in 1987, a fisherman friend had invited me for a skiff ride. It was an old wooden skiff, and he perched atop the outboard's cowling so the engine wouldn't fall off. Here, I told Mary, was where we searched for glass balls among bleached driftwood. Here's where we'd find wild irises. Here's where we'd sat on the wreck of an old boat and talked all afternoon. I'd never met anyone so earthy, so entirely of a place, embodying an all-out organic love for the sound. I'd only begun to recognize that in myself. Why aren't you married to him? Mary asked. I told her I was married to the place. Now I'm sitting in a meadow on Squire Island, surrounded by old trees. A few moments ago, I opened a bag of almonds, rustling the plastic. When I looked up, my eyes met those of a deer, 20 feet away. Her body tensed, ready to spring, her ears tipped sideways away from her face. She sniffed, trying to catch my scent. My heart stilled. The world stilled, as we stared at each other. She turned and slowly walked away. Every day is like this: life and death, beauty and disaster. And the last passage I want to read, just a short paragraph from years later, 1994, when Eva was walking with Craig and her stepson, Lars. One evening at dusk, Craig, Lars, and I rowed to shore and walked to the outer beach of Grass Island. Wading through waves of dead ryegrass, ducking under alder branches stripped of leaves, I held Lars's hand, trying to keep up with Craig's strides, which led us far down the beach. We reached a headland and stood leaning against it. The strait gleamed, though the sun was long down, so it seemed as though light, not water, sloshed against the shore below us. Everything was dying back, but the water was alive. I felt the cold air in my hair, the grittiness of rock beneath my hands. I felt like we might just disappear forever into that place. My time with the transients felt as if it were being reclaimed. Gathered in. It was not mine, had never been. It felt in a strange way like death, a dissolving, the way a salmon or orca carcass dissolves into beach stones and leaves behind a necklace, a shadow of its life. Now Lars held Craig's hand. I put my hand on Lars's head to fix that moment, that connection, that knowing into permanence. And just as a way to just close that circle, I'm going to read just a few paragraphs from an essay that my sister wrote called Wild Darkness. And this book was written in the last year of her life, when after she realized that she had her cancer had metastasized and had returned, and that her life was going to be shortened by the cancer. Wild Darkness. For 26 Septembers, I've hiked up streams littered with corpses of dying humpbacked salmon. It's nothing new, nothing surprising, not the stench, not the gore, not the thrashing of black humpies plowing past their dead brethren to spawn and die. It is familiar. Still, it is terrible and wild. Winged and furred predators gather at the stream mouths to pounce, pluck, tear, rip, and plunder the living, dying hordes. This September, it is just as terrible and wild as ever, and also new. I gather in the scene with different eyes. The eyes of someone whose own demise is no longer an abstraction. The eyes of someone who's experienced the tears, rips, and plunder of cancer treatment. In spring, I learned my breast cancer had come back, had metastasized to the pleura of my right lung. Metastatic breast cancer is incurable. Through its prism, I now see this world. Facing death in a death-phobic culture is lonely, but in wild places, like Prince William Sound and the woods and sloughs behind my house, it is different. The salmon dying in their stream tell me I am not alone. The evidence is everywhere, in the skull of an immature eagle I found in the woods, in the bones of a moose in the gully below my house, in the corpse of a wasp on the windowsill, in the fall of a birch leaf from its branch. These things tell me death is true, right, graceful, not tragic, not failure, not defeat. For this you were born, writes Stanley Kunitz. For this you were born, say the salmon. A tough, gritty fisherman friend I knew in my 20s called Prince William Sound God's country. It still is, and I am in good company here. We have no dominion over what the world will do to us, all of us. What the earth will make of our tinkering and abuse can be modeled by computers, but in the end is beyond our reckoning, our science. Nature is not simply done to. Nature responds. Nature talks back. Nature is willful. We have no dominion over the wild darkness that surrounds us. It is everywhere, under our feet, in the air we breathe, but we know nothing of it. We know more about the universe and the mind of an octopus than we do about death's true nature. We know only that it is terrible and inescapable and it is wild. Death is nature. Nature is far from over. In the end, the gore at the creek comforts more than it appalls. In the end, I must believe it. Just like a salmon, I will know how to die. And though I die, though I lose my life, nature wins. Nature endures. It is strange and it is hard, but it is comfort, and I'll take it. Thank you.